Thank you for listening. This course was created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional podcasts, books, newsletters, and cool merchandise await. Let's get started. Output validation is the set of checks and transformations that examine a model's response before it reaches users or downstream systems. It operates after generation and complements input controls by ensuring that fluent text adheres to organizational rules, safety policies, and technical contracts. Where input filtering treats incoming prompts as potentially hostile, output validation treats the model's own voice as untrusted. It parses structure, enforces allowed vocabularies, strips or redacts sensitive substrings, and formats answers to meet downstream contracts. This layer also mediates between human expectations and machine behavior by converting open-ended prose into constrained, auditable outputs that automation or people can rely on. You should treat validation as both a quality and a security function. It reduces hallucination risk, constrains exploitability, and creates artifact citations, provenance, and evidence links that support governance. In practice, a robust validator is modular, testable, and fast enough to run at scale without introducing unacceptable latency to conversational flows. Output validation matters because modern language models can produce persuasive but incorrect or unsafe content that looks trustworthy to people and machines alike. The risk spans misinformation and hallucination, legal exposure from unvetted claims, regulatory non-compliance when outputs leak protected data or provide regulated advice, and reputational harm when a polished but false answer spreads. For automated pipelines, unsafe outputs have second-order effects: a misleading summary that triggers an action, an authorization token that is fabricated by hallucination, or a code snippet that performs unintended operations can cascade into operational incidents. Layering validation into the pipeline creates a breakpoint where you can refuse, redact, or route outputs for human review, thereby limiting liability and preserving user trust. Viewed strategically, validation turns probabilistic text into governed communication that your organization can accept responsibility for, not merely apologize for later. Validation methods span a continuum from deterministic rules to probabilistic classifiers, and best practice combines techniques to balance precision and coverage. Rule-based checks implement explicit constraints, regular expressions, JSON schema validators, citation presence, or token blacklists that are fast, explainable, and easy to audit, making them ideal for syntactic guarantees and known risky patterns. Machine learning classifiers evaluate fuzzier properties, factuality likelihood, hallucination risk, or harmful intent using calibrated models trained on labeled examples. They add coverage where rules are brittle but demand ongoing retraining and monitoring. Pattern matching and heuristics catch common exploit primitives like prompt injection markers or suspicious code blocks, while hybrid pipelines route uncertain cases to human reviewers or secondary automated validators. The engineering trade-off is clear. Deterministic checks give clear rejections. Probabilistic models provide recall on subtle hazards. Orchestrating both with a decision policy yields the most pragmatic defense. Policy enforcement is the translation of organizational requirements into machine-executable checks that bind models to governance, compliance, and business constraints. Where policies might be natural language statements. Don't provide medical diagnoses. Do not reveal personally identifiable information. Always cite primary sources. Enforcement converts these into predicates and thresholds that validators can evaluate programmatically. This requires careful specification work. Legal and compliance teams must express requirements in testable terms, and engineers must implement validators that are auditable and versioned. Enforcement also includes automatic remediation, actions blocking, redaction, user warnings, or routing to human specialists. So policy violations trigger predictable responses rather than ad hoc judgment calls. When policy is codified and enforced, audits become straightforward, and governance becomes proactive rather than reactive. The artifact trail proves not only that you had rules, but that the system actually executed them. AI systems operate under many overlapping policy regimes that shape how outputs must be constrained, and validators must reconcile these demands without becoming paralyzed. Data protection policies limit how personal data can be used and surfaced, requiring redaction, minimization, or refusal when personal identifiers appear. Acceptable use rules embody organizational values, forbidding hate speech, facilitation of illegal activity, or targeted harassment. These are operationalized through toxicity classifiers and intent detection logic so outputs conform to behavioral norms. Regulatory compliance imposes domain-specific checks, financial advice disclaimers, consumer protection language, or healthcare guidance that may demand citations, jurisdictional tagging, or escalation to certified professionals. Business-specific constraints add further shape. Pricing engines must not reveal cost formulas, intellectual property must be protected, and contract language must follow approved templates. Balancing these regimes requires policy hierarchies, conflict resolution rules, and a governance process that maps legal intent to validator logic and operational thresholds. Syntactic validation enforces concrete structural expectations, so downstream systems and human consumers can interpret and act on outputs reliably and safely. This includes schema checking, ensuring JSON responses contain required fields, numeric values fall within acceptable ranges, dates are parsable, and enumerated types match allowed values, so that automated pipelines do not misinterpret malformed content. It also covers format constraints that preempt injection attempts, removing or escaping control characters, rejecting embedded executable blocks, and prohibiting inline markup that could be interpreted by downstream renderers or shells. By guaranteeing structure and basic sanity, syntactic validation reduces the attack surface and makes higher-layer semantic checks tractable. In many deployments, syntactic gates are the first, cheapest validators, fast to evaluate, and high precision, preventing obvious classes of failure while preserving compute for deeper semantic and policy analyses when necessary. Semantic validation moves beyond shape and syntax to ask whether what the model asserts is actually supported by evidence and coherent with domain knowledge. At its core, semantic checks compare generated claims to trusted sources, internal knowledge bases, canonical datasets, or authenticated APIs, and flag discrepancies for rejection or human review. This matters because fluent language can hide fabrications. A model may invent dates, misstate causality, or attribute statements to non-existent reports while sounding plausible. To operationalize semantic validation, you can use entailment models that score claim evidence pairs, retrieval over retrieval to locate independent corroboration, and consistency checks that ensure facts cited in one part of an answer line up with others. For example, when a model gives a clinical recommendation, semantic validation should insist on alignment with an approved guideline or require escalation. Think of it as a peer review step for machine pros. It asks the model to show its work and refuses confident assertions that lack a verifiable foundation, thereby preserving trust and reducing the likelihood of regulatory or reputational harm. Toxicity and bias filters aim to prevent outputs that harm individuals or groups, or that propagate unfair, discriminatory patterns learned from data. These filters combine classifiers trained to detect hate speech, slurs, or abusive language, with fairness detectors that highlight disproportionate treatment across demographic attributes. Why this matters is obvious. A model that amplifies bias or produces toxic language damages users, violates policies, and exposes organizations to legal and ethical risks. Practically, designers set operational thresholds, degrees of toxicity that trigger redaction, rewriting, or escalation, and tailor them by context. A clinical setting tolerates different language than a creative writing app. Bias detection requires careful calibration and intersectional awareness. Simple demographic proxies can mislead, so you should measure disparate impact across real-world slices and iterate on mitigations. Importantly, toxicity filters should be transparent and auditable, so you can explain why an output was suppressed and refine the thresholds as the social and regulatory environment evolves. Numerical and code validation enforces correctness where the cost of error is quantifiable and often high. Financial figures, dosages, calculations, scripts, and SQL queries. For numerical outputs, validation checks include unit consistency, bounds checking, checksum comparisons, and cross-references against authoritative numeric sources. When models produce code or commands, sandboxed execution in isolated environments is invaluable. Run snippets in constrained containers that record side effects, timeouts, and resource usage, and only allow safe, read-only operations when appropriate. Reject or flag operations that attempt unsafe actions, file system writes, outbound network calls, privileged process spawns, and require human sign-off for anything that modifies production. For example, a generated billing adjustment should be validated against ledgers and business rules before being applied. A suggested database migration script should be syntax checked and dry run in a staging context. Treat code outputs as actions, not just text. Validate, simulate, and limit their capacity to do real-world harm. Chaining validators creates a pipeline of complementary checks that reduces false negatives while balancing latency and resource use. Start with cheap, deterministic filters, escape sequences, blacklist patterns, JSON schema checks that catch the low-hanging fruit with negligible cost. Route survivors to medium-cost validators such as entailment classifiers, toxicity detectors, and numerical sanity checks, and reserve expensive validations, sandboxed execution, manual review, multi-source corroboration for high-impact or ambiguous cases. The benefit of chaining is robustness. A single classifier's blind spot is less likely to compromise the whole system when multiple orthogonal validators inspect the output. The trade-off is added latency and complexity. Each stage increases response time and the operational surface to maintain. To manage this, apply adaptive strategies. Only invoke heavy validators when risk scores exceed thresholds, cache prior validations for repeated queries, and parallelize independent checks where feasible. With thoughtful orchestration, chaining achieves strong coverage while keeping the user experience acceptable for common, low-risk interactions. Monitoring validation failures turns rejected outputs from mere exceptions into actionable intelligence about model weaknesses, attack attempts, and policy misconfigurations. Log each rejection with structured metadata, the offending output, which validators flagged it, source documents used for grounding, the user query, and contextual risk scores. Aggregate metrics, rejection rates by template, false negative backfills from human review, and trends in specific failure modes reveal whether problems stem from the model, the retrieval layer, or policy definitions. Alerting should prioritize clusters indicating adversarial activity, sudden spikes in prompt injection markers, or repeated attempts to coax disallowed content, while also surfacing systemic issues like calibration drift or recent model changes that increase hallucination. Continuous adjustment closes the loop. Use labeled failures to retrain classifiers, refine rules, and improve grounding sources. Over time, monitoring converts validation failures into fewer and less severe incidents, because each rejection becomes a lesson that hardens the validator suite. Integration with governance ties validation outcomes into organizational accountability, compliance, and continuous improvement. Validators should emit auditable artifacts, claim evidence links, rejection rationales, and policy rule identifiers that feed into incident dashboards and compliance reports, enabling reviewers to trace a decision from the user prompt through each validation stage to the final action. Policy updates must be versioned and mapped to the technical checks that enforce them, so a legal change in acceptable disclosures translates to updated rules and immediate test coverage. Governance processes establish who can change thresholds, how exceptions are approved, and how human reviewers are trained and certified. reducing ad hoc decisions that undermine consistency. For regulated domains, preserve evidence packets for audit, inputs, retrieved context, validation outputs, and the final response, stored in tamper-resistant logs with retention aligned to legal requirements. In short, make validation not only a runtime safety net, but a documented, managed practice that satisfies both operational needs and external scrutiny. Operational deployment places validators where they do the most good without becoming a bottleneck, and that requires deliberate architectural choices. Put low-cost, deterministic checks at the gateway or edge so malformed, injectable, or obviously disallowed outputs never enter downstream workflows. These are your fast syntactic gates that run on every response. Route medium-cost semantic and toxicity checks to a centralized validation service that can scale independently and apply heavier models, caching, and parallelization when risk scores justify the expense. Design modular validator services with clear interfaces so new checks, language-specific fact-checkers, or domain-specific code sandboxes can be added without rewriting the pipeline. Define fallback behaviors up front. When validation blocks an answer, should the system abstain, return a partial but safe response, or queue a human reviewer? Decide these policies for each class of request and document them. Deployment is as much about predictable behavior under failure as it is about normal operation, and predictability is what keeps users comfortable and regulators satisfied. Choosing metrics for validation forces clarity about what you are protecting and what you accept as trade-offs, and those metrics should be both operational and risk-focused. Track false positives and false negatives separately, because conflating them hides problems. False positives cost user trust and workflow efficiency, while false negatives leave you exposed to harm and liability. Measure coverage across content types, plain text, code, tables, and multimedia summaries so you know where blind spots concentrate. Monitor latency overhead, introduced by validators, and set budgets per interaction class to avoid unacceptable user experience degradation. Use effectiveness scoring that combines detection rates with severity-weighted impact, for example, counting a missed toxic output against a direct safety incident more heavily than a minor factual slip. Finally, slice metrics by domain, model version, and tenant so you can prioritize fixes where they reduce the most risk, not just where they improve aggregate numbers. Scaling validation at production volumes requires engineering discipline. Parallelization, caching, approximate checks, and tiering are your friends, but so is careful scope reduction. For high-throughput, low-risk traffic, rely on lightweight filters and probabilistic samplers that surface a representative subset for deeper checks. Reserve full entailment and sandbox runs for high-stakes queries. Multilingual and multimodal content complicates matters. Validators must support multiple languages and media types, and you should measure per-language coverage and error profiles because a defense effective in English might be blind in another tongue. Distributed environments demand consistent policy enforcement across regions, so push policy evaluation points into edge nodes while maintaining centralized rule management to avoid drift. Resource overhead can be controlled by batching similar validations, caching verdicts for repeated prompts, and employing adaptive sampling that increases scrutiny for emerging risk patterns. Scalability is not only technical, it is a product decision about which flows warrant maximal protection and which can accept lighter guardrails. Adaptive enforcement lets your system evolve in near real time as risk changes without manual redeployment, and it hinges on a feedback loop from monitoring into policy execution. Implement dynamic policy updates that can flip thresholds, add or remove validators, or change fallback modes based on signals such as active attack campaigns, new regulatory notices, or sudden model regressions. Automate safe rollouts, gradual percentage-based deployments, and canary checks, so policy changes are exercised in production with limited blast radius. Couple adaptation with human review for high-impact adjustments, so automated tuning does not drift into unsafe permissiveness. Context-specific filtering is essential. The same phrase could be acceptable in a coding assistant yet dangerous in medical advice. your enforcement must apply domain-aware rules that adjust in context. Feedback-driven tuning closes the loop. Use labeled validation failures to retrain classifiers and update rule sets, turning attacks into defenses over time. Alignment with safety frames validation as part of a broader safety program rather than a lone gatekeeper. Output validation complements content filters by focusing on what the model actually produces rather than only what you prevented at the input, and it distinguishes between adversarial controls and safety controls. Some checks aim to stop exploitation, others to ensure user well-being or legal compliance. Integrate validation outcomes into safety governance. Feed rejection trends into model governance boards, include validation KPIs and release criteria, and require remediation plans for categories that repeatedly fail validation. Treat validation artifacts claim evidence mappings, redaction logs, and blocked response statistics as inputs to your safety taxonomy so you can trace whether model changes shift the type or frequency of risks. When safety and security operate together rather than in silos, you get unified resilience, fewer escapes, faster learning from incidents, and clearer accountability for decisions that matter. Strategically, output validation and policy enforcement are investments in the product's credibility and legal posture, not just engineering overhead. They reduce the probability of high-impact incidents, defamatory statements, regulatory violations, or harmful guidance that erode user trust and invite costly remediation. By codifying policies into testable validators, you make governance demonstrable to auditors and partners, shortening the path to approval for sensitive use cases. Validation also enables richer monetization. Customers will pay a premium for evidence-backed, auditable responses in regulated domains when you can show strong validation metrics and short mean time to remediate. Finally, accept that limits remain. Validation cannot guarantee absolute truth or stop a highly adaptive adversary. But it shifts the economics. Attackers must spend more effort for diminishing returns, and defenders gain time to detect, respond, and learn. In that sense, validation is a strategic lever. It raises the floor of acceptable risk and lets your organization operate confidently where others cannot. No validation layer is omnipotent, and understanding that limitation is the first step towards sensible defenses. Models produce probabilistic outputs, not hard facts, and validators, whether rule-based or learned, operate with imperfect signal, concept drift, and bounded context. The truth of a statement depends on up-to-date, authoritative sources. If those sources are stale, incomplete, or themselves poisoned, semantic checks can be misled. Adversaries respond to defenses. When one pattern is blocked, they craft new permutations that evade heuristics and classifiers. This is the classical arms race. Stricter gates reduce false negatives but increase false positives, frustrating users, and sometimes driving workarounds that create fresh risk. Therefore, a practical program acknowledges residual risk, documents acceptable failure modes, and pairs validation with detection and response so errors are visible and repairable rather than silent and catastrophic. In short, validation raises the floor of safety but does not eliminate uncertainty, and it must be designed around that reality. Operationally, the limits of validation demand clear policies for what happens when checks fail. Build user experiences that convey uncertainty, graceful abstention, partial answers with explicit caveats, or offers to escalate to human review. Define service-level rules for classes of failures. How long human review can take, which queries require immediate escalation, and when to fall back to permissive behavior for low-risk flows. Keep an explainable rejection channel so callers understand why an output was blocked and how to rephrase safely. This reduces friction and helps surface false positives that should be tuned. Log rejected outputs with context-rich artifacts, prompt, retrieved evidence, and validator rationale to accelerate remediation. Finally, make incident playbooks concrete. Who is paged when a high-risk false negative escapes, which legal notifications are required, and how remediation and user remediation are coordinated. Operational clarity converts validation limits from a source of dread into manageable, governed procedures. Validation should not be an island. Embed it into the model and product lifecycle so failures become inputs that improve the whole system. Feed rejected and corrected outputs back into training and evaluation pipelines, so classifiers, entailment systems, and retrieval rankers learn from real-world edge cases. Use validation signals to gate releases. Baseline supported claim rates, toxicity thresholds, and latency budgets should be part of pre-deployment checks that prevent regressions from reaching users. Connect validation telemetry into model governance policy committees, compliance reviews, and change approvals, so trade-offs between utility and safety are decided transparently and recorded. Think of validation as both a quality control sensor and an instrument for continuous improvement. It detects current problems while generating the labeled evidence necessary to harden models and policies for tomorrow. When lifecycle integration is real, validation becomes a lever for systemic resilience rather than a brittle stopgap. Measuring validation effectiveness transforms intuition into actionable improvement plans. Track false positive and false negative rates separately by domain, language, and content type, so you can prioritize whether to tune models, rewrite rules, or accept user friction. Monitor supported claim rate, injection neutralization rate, and time to remediate for blocked items, weighting each by potential impact to reflect business risk. Use canary experiments and A/B tests to validate policy changes before wide rollout, and run periodic red team sweeps to estimate live adversary success rates under current defenses. Instrument latency and cost so you can decide where to apply heavyweight semantic checks versus lightweight syntactic gates. Importantly, slice metrics by tenant and high-consequence use cases, health, finance, legal, because a tolerable error rate in casual chat is intolerable in regulated contexts. With disciplined measurement, validation moves from guesswork to engineering, enabling targeted investments that improve safety per dollar spent. Socio-technical practice matters. Validation succeeds when engineering, legal, product, and safety teams collaborate, and when reviewers are trained and empowered. Translate legal and regulatory requirements into testable rules, with legal owning the intent and engineers owning the implementation and test coverage. Train human reviewers on consistent adjudication so their labels feed back reliably into model updates and classifier retraining. Encourage a culture of reporting and learning. Surface false positives without blame. Treat incidents as data, and reward improvements in supported claim rates and reduced incident severity. Maintain documentation and audit trails for policy changes, reviewer guidelines, and exception approvals so governance can trace decisions and demonstrate compliance. Finally, communicate to customers and users what validation does and does not guarantee. Transparency reduces surprise and helps set expectations that align with the system's real capabilities. Output validation and policy enforcement together form a layered, pragmatic defense that converts probabilistic models into accountable systems. We reviewed syntactic checks that guard format and structure, semantic grounding that insists on evidence, toxicity and bias filters that protect people, numerical and code validators that simulate and sandbox actions, and orchestrated pipelines that trade latency for assurance. We also confronted limits. No validator guarantees absolute truth, adversaries adapt, and trade-offs with usability are inevitable. Then described operational patterns to manage those limits: human in-loop escalation, clear SLAs, metric-driven tuning, and governance integration. Strategically, validation reduces legal, reputational, and operational risk while enabling higher assurance use cases that would otherwise be off-limits. With these practices in place, you are ready to move into adversarial readiness. The next chapter will examine red teaming techniques that probe validation, helping you find blind spots before attackers do. Thanks for tuning in to Bare Metal Cyber, your trusted source for cybersecurity educational materials, news, and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.